Continuing with our reading of From a Mountain in Tibet, starting on page 40. Initially, I was more puzzled than worried. I could not reconcile the news that the Chinese soldiers were ransacking monasteries and insulting monks and nuns with my impression of the smartly dressed strangers I had seen passing through Darak. They had seemed so disciplined, not chaotic or aggressive at all. Then again, they hadn't understood the first thing about us. That was plain from their reaction to our clapping and our stinky smoke offering. Perhaps they didn't realize what they were doing when they threw texts and relics on the ground. Though to lay hands on another person violently was always wrong. Surely they knew that. The atmosphere in the monastery grew tense. I was unhappy enough on my own account, but even I noticed that people seemed worried. Jamyang was less inclined to laugh with me. Akom seemed preoccupied. The Lhadron cooks were morose. There were more and more visits from Lamas with monasteries in other parts of the country, and the news they brought was always bad. Some of them began to talk openly about the need to escape Tibet. Still, it was hard to know how to interpret what was going on. Our Tibetan government had signed an agreement with the communists back in 1951, recognizing that Tibet was an integral part of China. In return, the Chinese agreed to allow the Dalai Lama to remain in power and the existing social and religious structures to remain in place in the short term. The ominous subtext was that at some point Tibet would be transformed into a people's democratic state with the complete dismantling of her way of life. Tibetan pleas for international support had fallen on deaf ears. And so the Dalai Lama's government had no choice but to capitulate in the face of vastly superior power. We Tibetans had grown used to an uneasy sense of muddling along in the intervening years. But was that period of compromise now coming to a close? If so, what would happen next? It was difficult to imagine that the Chinese would actually destroy our society. The cultural and religious links between China and Tibet went back many hundreds of years. Within my own Kagyu lineage, there was a long connection between our head lamas, the Karmapas, and the emperors of China. The Karmapas had been tutors of Buddhism to emperors ever since the time of the second Karmapa. Karmapachi in the 13th century. All of this shared history made it impossible to grasp that we had now entered a very different era. The new rulers of China believed in class struggle and the inevitable victory of the proletariat. They believed in material progress. They did not believe in Buddhism. They viewed the monks and lamas as enemies of the people, exploiting the peasants, whom they deliberately kept in ignorance. To us Tibetans, material progress, such as new schools and roads the Chinese had built over the past few years, was merely changing the outer appearance of things. We were deeply devoted to an entirely different way of seeing existence, as the transformation of the mind in its cyclic journey over many lifetimes. So the Marxist concept of liberation did not ring true for most of us. This clash of mindsets, combined with Chinese vast military power, meant that defeat was inevitable. I didn't yet know it, but we were already living through the destruction of Tibet. It was another year or so before Akon received confirmation that the situation was now so desperate that his life and the life of the Sangha was actually in danger. Refugees began to flood into Kham from Derje province. They confirmed that monasteries were being looted. Lamas were being rounded up and shot. People were displaced and starving. Anyone suspected of having resistance sympathies was being killed. There were informers everywhere, and a feeling of panic pervaded every village. And then came the rumor that His Holiness the Dalai Lama had fled Lhasa in fear of his life. The first I heard with my own ears of all of this was from the lips of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. I met Trungpa, who was to have so much influence in my life, in the midsummer of 1958. He arrived at Dolmolakin with the now customary bad news, this time of armed troops in Chamdo and increasingly bitter fighting between the resistance and the communists. I'd heard a great deal about him, of course. The 11th Trungpa Rinpoche was a very high Lama, abbot of a large and prestigious monastery complex, Surmang, located several days by horse from Dolmolakan. Trungpa was also a great friend of Akon's. He had spent 6 months at Dolmolakan 2 years before my arrival, giving a Wangkur, rite of empowerment, on the treasury of the mine of precious teachings a lengthy and complex teaching that had attracted hundreds of people to the monastery to receive it. He and Akon had also spent many months together at Sechen, receiving teachings from their mutual guru, Jamjong Kongtrul Rinpoche, before traveling to Palpong to hear His Holiness the Karmapa's report from Peking, and then meet with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Derji. Trungpa was the same age as Akon, and was already a notably learned and charismatic spiritual leader. I was more than a little in awe of him, but he was warm and friendly with me. I immediately formed a bond with him that lasted until his death in the 1980s. From the day Trungpa and his small party arrived, I knew we had entered a state of crisis. My brother had asked him to perform various ceremonies, and I remember that in one address Trungpa said our way of life would soon change beyond recognition. Everything we now relied upon would crumble beneath our feet. He had received this insight from a divination, and the impact of his words on all of us was dreadful. I sat in the temple and struggled to understand what I was hearing. I was appalled at the stories of destruction and death, and frightened at the thought of more to come. But I also felt a secret excitement, because this wave of destructive change contained within it the possibility of my escape from the monastery. Trungpa was being asked to give teachings in monasteries all over the district. Before he left Dolmalakan, he sent a message to His Holiness the Karmapa, asking for advice on what to do. Should he go back to his monastery as one of his senior advisors? Sethar, the bursar of Surnang, insisted was the best course of action? Or was it preferable to seek safety in central Tibet, or even escape over the Himalayas to India? To his dismay, the Karmapa said he must make up his own mind. Trungpa then wrote to another High Lama, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, but he got a similar answer. Not long after Trungpa's departure to give teachings at a monastery of Yag, a messenger arrived at Dolmalakan with the tragic news that the esteemed master, Jamjong Kongtrul Rinpoche, had been captured by the Chinese and had died in prison. Akon got another message, this time from Trungpa, saying he had gone into hiding as he was being hunted by the communists. Could Akon join him in the remote valley where he was sheltering, so they could meditate upon the correct course of action? Not long afterwards, we heard that resistance fighters had taken refuge in Trungpa's monastery, and the communists had captured and destroyed it. They had desecrated the tomb of the previous Trungpa incarnation and destroyed the library of sacred texts. Many of the senior lamas had been shot dead, and most of the monks taken prisoners and sent to forced labor. Trungpa left the valley where he'd been hiding, and with Akong's help went into retreat for a few weeks in a secluded cave. He was determined to decide once and for all what to do. Continuing on page 40 with our discussion of From a Mountain in Tibet.
Well, it must have been a sad news that Lama Yeshe was hearing while he was there, and it seemed to, the more news came in, it seemed to get worse and worse. And it must have been a bit frightening, because they must have been thinking, when is it going to come to their place where they were there in the... And I knew they had to come to some decisions about leaving. And that's why Akram and Shelford Trungpa went to meditate to make see what move they were going to make. So it was right what you're saying. If they killed the Tulkus, who would be left to teach, carry on? So they had for that reason, I think they had to escape.
They thought it through very, very carefully, didn't they?
Yes, they did. I think, and I'm sure it was a very rough journey travelling. When they did make the decision, we had a very rough and hard journey.
That's why they would have to be certain before they started it, right? Before they headed out.
Yeah.
They would have to have that inner certainty.
That's it.
Because it wouldn't have been the same if they'd been relying on someone having told them to go or to do something else.
Yeah.
It had to come from inside them.
Yes.
And also it came from their practice, didn't it?
It did.
When the going got tough, when everything was falling apart, they turned inward and they really put their practice to the test.
Yes. I was just wondering what that cave it was they went to. I just wondered if it was Guru Rinpoche's cave, the crystal cave. But didn't say, it didn't mention that, but well, anyway.
It was a very special place.
It was a very special place, that was the main point.
And isn't it beautiful that Rinpoche supported Chogyam Trungpa in turning to a time of retreat when other solutions might have been pressing in on them.
That's right.
They actually stopped.
And held out for a while before the final decision was made what we were going to do.
Yes.
You know, they didn't just go right away to hang on, because it was possible that things could have changed, which didn't, but it was a possibility, you know.
Wasn't it interesting that both the 16th Karmapa and Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche would not give them advice?
No.
It was really a very powerful moment, not only to experience, but to be hearing about it and thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, they left the decision up to them. They had to decide, you know.
It was their karma.
Yeah. So
they had to step in and interpret and choose.
Yeah.
It was their choice.
That's right. They had to do it.
They were very young men at the time.
That's right, yeah.
They were in their late teens, weren't they?
That's right.
And all these lives were resting on their decision, and the safety of the people around them was resting on their decision.
Yes.
if there was ever a moment of seeing interconnectedness and interdependence.
It's amazing that the decision was made on a younger head and not an older head,
Yes,
you know.
yes.
Well, the Kamapa and the Hokkaido were older heads, but they left it to the younger heads to make the decision.
Yes. Well, they were placing them to the center of their own dramas or their own stories.
That's right, yes.
It was going to be their outcome.
They had to decide. Well, they actually end up had to leave as well, to Hokkaido and Kamapa too.
That's correct. They
leave.
all left.
They all left.
They all came to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
I find it so heartbreaking that there was no one outside of Tibet that was caring enough to help.
Yeah.
I think this is such a huge tragedy, and it was such a lost opportunity for the world to exhibit caring for one another.
Well, all this was predicted by Guru Rinpoche.
That's correct.
Yes.
It doesn't make it any easier to hear, though, does it?
No.
When we know that the countries that we have come from turned a deaf ear.
Yes.
That's very, very sad and distressing.
Well, as you say, the other people who weren't so strongly spiritual people, the more and more material side themselves.
That's right.
You know, and the people that were spiritual had no power. The people were in power in the West were materialistic, and they had the power, and then it was, you know.
Yes.
That was that.
So it was a missed opportunity for showing compassion and the positive side of all of our interconnectedness.
But anyway, what happened when maybe I'll speak about it later on in the chapter.
Stay where we are.
Yeah, stay where
it's
we
very it's very discomforting, and we want to get out of it. we want to be away from this challenging situation. And yet we see in both Rinpoche's examples that they went inward and they faced it, and they stayed with the discomfort, and they turned to their practice and were inspired to become the heroes and the noble ones and Shambhala's warriors in this very, very dark period, in this age of wastage.
Yes,
they rose to the occasion, and it is inspiring for us to realize that they stepped forward and carried the banner, the victory banner.
Yes, and as Guru Rinpoche said, it was the karma for this to happen, and the question arises in my mind: what was the karma that caused this?
Yes.
Yes.
Historically.
Yes, historically, yes.
And Guru Rinpoche also said, did he not, that in the darkest ages the light of the Vajrayana will burn even brighter.
More fiercely.
More fiercely.
Yeah.
And that is the inspiration we can take away from this.
Yeah. So Guru Rinpoche is a practice for this age, for this very age.
Omahung Benza Guru Pema Siddhi Hung. We have such gratitude for both Rinpoches for being courageous and for ensuring that the teachings were preserved.
Yes.
Thank you, Rinpoches.
Yes. And through their escape, a lot of teachings were saved. I know a lot got destroyed, but an awful lot got saved as well. And I think maybe a lot of teachings got took away before this actually happened, you know.
There were lots of predictions.
Yes, aye. So not everything got I suppose some rare text was destroyed, which is a pity. But what can you do about it? It's a funny thing in history that all the invasions all did the Muslims did the same. Destroyed temples, burnt the texts and all that. That seems to be the thing they do all the time when they're invading different countries. When it comes to the spiritual side of things, they don't destroy the temples and burn the text. You know, a reason for aim for that, you know, is the strong disbelief in karma. Because of the strong disbelief, monasteries not to be destroyed, the disbelief in the spiritual life of things, in the dharma and the karma. That's why all these temples got destroyed, because they had disbelief in what they were doing. Okay.
Okay. And we can feel the immensity of it.
Yeah.
And we can also remember that they triumphed.
Yeah. Well, there's also a bigger triumph to come, but we can discuss that later on. A bigger triumph. Right.
So we stick with our discomfort, and we stick with the difficult part of the story, and we carry on.
Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Tari Turi Soha, Om Ahung Beza Guru Pema Siddhi Hung.
Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Tari Turi Soha, Om Ahung Beza Guru Pema Siddhi Hung.
Okay.
Okay.